Yeah, this talk is going to be a more higher level overview of cryptocurrency, what opportunities there are to go forwards, like how we can be doing things better, because right now I see a very big failing of cryptocurrency. Just last month, there was a report released by an anti-terror organization called MEMRI, M-E-M-R-I. I don't know how I'm going to do this with all this stuff in my hand. Who released a report which is about how ISIS is making extensive use of Bitcoin and cryptocurrency to fund their operations. This is a group that, with several $100 million per day in oil revenue, was able to take over basically huge swaths of land from Iraq and Syria. And that kind of capital that we're talking about is basically a drop in the ocean of what is going on in cryptocurrency right now. And even in terms of the wider thing, when you look at the amount of capital that's moving through cryptocurrency, that in terms of the global system is a drop in the ocean. So it's really incredible to think that with such a tiny amount of capital, the amount of social ramification or transformation that can happen. Another interesting thing about ISIS was they actually started in 2015 and 2014. They started to mint their own gold-backed currency as a way to escape the central banks and the US dollar. My premise is that we are in the process of an old order that is gradually losing power with new technologies on the horizon, ecological destruction, resource conflicts, new emerging powers like China and Russia, and the conflict of interests with the global hegemony. And cryptocurrency is also at a very key gateway of that nexus, where we are seeing basically the emergence of new elites or new elites that are basically trying to take power from an old elite. And the way that we can, if we go really back to the origins of cryptocurrency, to Bitcoin, in the beginning, Bitcoin, like this guy knows, he was there as well. It was worthless. It was just like a joke project on the internet, that some of us happened to find, and through investigation, we saw that there was a great potential for this, and kind of exploded much quicker than anybody expected. And what's interesting is that cryptography in general is a field that has been around since the 90s. There has been a lot of thought and vision about how cryptography in general could be used as a transformative power over the world. And yet it kind of remained stagnant for a very long time. And with the emergence of Bitcoin, a lot of these techniques from the 90s started to be picked up by people and started to be applied into real life, into real code. And basically what happened with Bitcoin is, there was Gavin Andresen, and there's a group of business guys who, they started to see, there started to be these new young developers that were upstarts within the project, and they basically tried to cement their power over the project, to maintain control over the project, and to control the narrative. And what happened, and then with our project, the Dark Wallet, there was a line in the sand between one group of people who saw Bitcoin as a radically transformative political force, and the other one that wanted to integrate with capital markets and finance and the business class of people. And that revolt actually continued on until the engineers actually ended up taking over Bitcoin. And the engineers were very principled, But then what has happened is the engineers have a very particular way of seeing the world, which when we're an engineer, we tend to reduce things down to mechanisms that we can understand, that can be used in certain way. And there's a tendency of engineers to really get hyper-focused on details, almost like an autistic level. And what happened is that Bitcoin got stuck in this very linear trajectory. And there were a lot of people who had a greater vision of what was possible with Bitcoin. And those people actually ended up revolting against Bitcoin, they actually left from Bitcoin, and they were the people that founded Ethereum. And then there was another group of people who were also more idealistic or more visionary, and but they were more from, I guess, a kind of financial background, and they would have formed Bitcoin Cash. And then the more radical ones of those people went and maybe formed, subgroups within Bitcoin Cash or other currencies. And Ethereum, the problem with Ethereum is, the people, they're too idealistic, they're not very practical, and, because of that, there's now been a new community, which is the Web3, the Polkadot people. So the basic landscape of this cryptocurrency community is like a massive amount of fragmentation, is a lot of diversion into like many different subfields and paths. What's actually interesting is that in the early days of cryptocurrency and Bitcoin, there was a lot of talk about the power of cryptocurrency and the dream of cryptocurrency. The people, you could go nowhere without hearing people talking about the evils of central banks, how cryptocurrency was going to take down the Federal Reserve. That was a big driving force and inspiration for a lot of people today. And today, a lot of that narrative has been lost. And the argument that I would make is that yes, while capitalization is important because it's what enable products to be developed, products that go into the hands of people, at the same time, you need to have visionaries and you need to nurture that intellectual culture, because that is what drive new paradigms of technology forwards. And the crypto community has kind of found itself now in a stagnant, stable spot where it's no longer able to innovate or to go forwards. We're kind of like in the era of maybe the early web, when there was like a boom and there were all these projects which ended up to collapse. It's especially from non-programmers, there's a tendency to say things like cryptocurrency is the laws of physics. Cryptocurrency cannot be broken because cryptography cannot be broken, and cryptography cannot be broken because physics cannot be broken. But that's not exactly true. Cryptography is broken all the time. Cryptography algorithms have new weaknesses found in them. Quantum computers might be around the corner. We don't know. Even programmers themselves make mistakes. Technology itself is not a fixed thing. Like, we're always making upgrades to technology. We're always adding new features. New projects came along. Like, a lot of the projects that exist today, were unimaginable 5 years ago or 8 years ago. So this is not a fixed object that's just hanging in cyberspace. It's a social phenomenon. It's actually, I would argue, it's an artifact that is used by this new elite as a way of tricking an older elite, as a way of, it's like an artifice that we're using as a form of power. So, when we understand that, if we take this view of technology, we also understand that the social relations or the organization of the community is incredibly important, and how we nurture that community to be able to better develop technologies that answer social problems. So right now, the cryptocurrency, as a movement, there is a huge amount of capitalization going into many projects, and yet these projects are not able to deliver. There is an immense amount of focus on techniques and mechanisms, but very little connecting of the dots, how to put these into a coherent paradigm, how to develop infrastructure and structure. For example, when I was in Syria, I was in the local administration. I was responsible for reviewing technology projects, in a region of 5 million people. And I go, okay, how do we deploy cryptocurrency on a national scale? You know, we can pass laws. You know, we have the cooperation of the local authorities. So first of all, inside of cryptocurrency community, where do I go? You know, there is no organizations, there are no responsible bodies who are focused on this kind of adoption curve, you know. There's a lot of rhetoric, a lot of fake news around Venezuela or Cyprus or Iran or any of these countries, but it really doesn't match up with reality and reality of adoption. The second thing I started to think, okay, practically, how am I going to implement this? I started to look about technologies. How am I going to deploy a payments network? You know, how am I going to make it practical to set up the infrastructure to allow people to use this technology on a national scale? And I saw there's no projects that exist now, because the mentality now is a focus on consumer level products. How do we develop a better app for the phone or a better way for individuals to use cryptocurrency, as opposed to how can we deploy infrastructure on a large scale? And there's a difference in those types of technology. So the ideas are incredibly important in the formation of technology. If we go back to the 60s, at the time, computers, they were massive devices that took up entire rooms. And if you wanted to use them, you had to make an appointment, and each person could use them one at a time. And there was a guy that came along, his name was John McCarthy. He was actually the guy that invented artificial intelligence. He also invented the Lisp programming language. He contributed a lot to computer science in general. And this guy, he had the thought that what if a computer was not just like a computer that one person used at one time, but what if it was like an electrical utility which you could plug your terminal in the wall and everybody could have access to this computing power. And John McCarthy, he was also a radical communist. Like, he was a guy that was very much influenced by his ideas, and that mental framework was able to give him a different perspective onto computers, about how we design computers, which after the Cuban Missile Crisis, America, they saw how bad their information response was, and they were shopping around for like a new way of organizing their information systems. And that's when they came across John McCarthy's idea, and they started to pour a lot of funding into it. And that's basically what led to something called Project Mac, which Project Mac led to ARPANET, and then the internet, and also led to Unix, the foundation of all the modern operating systems. So there's an important thinker called Lewis Mumford, and he actually described that in terms of technology, there is two modalities of technology development. One is technology which kind of just developed for its own sake, and the other is technology which exists inside of a complex framework, like a sociological framework. So if we can understand exactly what it is we're trying to create, then we are able to create an ecosystem of products, an ecosystem of technologies that enable us to make a change on a bigger level. So, after ARPANET and internet, and also the development of the first time-sharing computer operating system, which was the idea of an operating system where it's not just one person on one computer, but a multi-user system where not only can you just run one program at a time, but you can run many programs at the same time. There was a kind of race in the 70s between many operating system development teams. There was ITS, there was Multics, there was CP40. All of these operating systems, they were taking all the research from academia, and they were going, we are going to develop the perfect operating system. And they were going through, and they were designing each piece bit by bit. They were really focused on, developing the best, most complete, perfect operating system. And there were some developers from all of these projects who they were very dissatisfied with how the approach to development was going. and they said, okay, we are going to go off and we're going to make our own operating system, and we're going to focus on minimalism and simplicity. And they were able to take the best ideas that existed at that time, and they were able to iterate very quickly, and they were able to develop a functional operating system, which was Unix. And Unix is the birth of all the modern operating systems. All of the concepts that we use today were invented in Unix. The file system, networking sockets, the memory layout model in computers, everything was invented with Unix. So we see a very similar situation today in cryptocurrency. You have all of these big projects, Ethereum, EOS, Web3, Polkadot, and what these projects are doing is they are trying to develop the most complete, perfect blockchain system. They are sucking in huge amounts of capital to pay huge amounts of salaries to people to develop little pieces bit by bit to develop an entire ecosystem. That is a completely backwards approach to the actual way that software is developed, or good software is developed. Instead of focusing on the technology, there need to be a focus on the products. And the products also have to fit together in some kind of paradigm or model. It's through developing the products that we develop the technology. So there is a thinker, Peter Hintians, and what was this guy, Peter Hintians? Yeah, this guy is probably, I think, one of the best developers, or one of the most important developers of this century, and he basically wrote a lot about how can we develop good software. And one of the most interesting insights that he had was that building good software is not just about the technology or the concepts, or like you've got some magical new crypto technique that nobody else has. Building good software is about how people interact together, because programming is a kind of art. You can have all of the money in the world and you will still not be able to produce great code. You can buy the best developer and you won't. And if that developer is not inspired and he feels no heart in what he's creating, it will just be garbage. So there has to be some kind of some kind of fabric. There has to be something that is able to pull these technologies together to allow them to think on a deeper level, to use their skill sets to produce great software. And he focused a lot, not just on the technology itself. He contributed a lot of great technology, but also the processes around developing software, how we create communities around the software. And that's a big mistake with a lot of these big blockchain projects, is they're focused on the money, on the capital, on the design of the project, but they're not thinking about real world usage or deployment of their projects. They're not thinking about, what opportunities exist in the world, like what countries or geographical regions can we target. That kind of analysis, which is a very typical kind of analysis that's done in any kind of business, is missing from blockchain space. It's all very abstract products, assuming that all of the people across the world, they're the same. But as we know, markets are very layered and very different from region to region. And one of the software that he developed, Peter Hintians, was a software called ZeroMQ. And ZeroMQ was very interesting because ZeroMQ was about how can we build large, complex networks by having these very basic patterns, not socket patterns, network patterns. We could slot together to create larger network infrastructure. And his background actually was he was programming financial applications, and he got the inspiration from thinking about how could you make financial applications more efficient and faster. And that's when he realized that the classic model of having a centralized broker, which all the little financial daemons or computer programs talked to coordinate their action, was a broken model. And instead he came up with the idea that, okay, if the abstractions or the patterns that the programmers used to build this infrastructure were better designed, then the programmers could reason about how all these programs communicate together, and they wouldn't need to rely on a centralized broker, and it would be more efficient because they won't have to go through a central point of failure. and also the infrastructure could be more resilient as well. And what's interesting about this is that's a very similar philosophy to what actually drove Unix originally, which all these big operating system projects, they're trying to create the perfect operating system. And Unix said, okay, the way that we're going to develop complex software is by creating programs that can be chained together or put together in ways that originally the programmer did not envision to create more complex functionality. And what that enabled Unix to do was to be able to adapt and to be able to change. It was a very flexible tool that could be adapted to different use cases. So at the time in the 70s when Unix was developed, they really brought a fresh new wave of thinking to computer technology. They created this new paradigm of computers. And yet, I somehow feel that the people at the time in the 70s, they were limited by the speed of the computers, by the size of the bandwidth that they had, and they weren't able to take these ideas really to their full extent, they were limited by the computers that they had at the time. And yet what's interesting is about that is that the modern computer systems that we use today are essentially the same computers that were invented in the 70s. So that means in over 50 years, computers have not changed. Computers have got faster, they've got smaller, but fundamentally it's still the same computer devices that we use. And so now there is a wealth of new techniques and new mechanisms available to us, and yet they just kind of need to be deployed, to build these larger subsystems, computing in general hasn't changed in over 50 years, and really even basic tasks like sharing a file between someone is like incredibly difficult, and it doesn't need to be that way. Like computers should be seamless, really. And part of this is there is right now there is like this paradigm or focus on users or like consumers of technology. Even the layout of how the phone is designed is like, it's basically obvious it's a device built for personal consumption. It's the computing devices that we have, they're not enabling humans at scale to enable a social infrastructure. Part of the idea or concept behind civilization itself is the idea that millions of human beings can cooperate in these larger systems, where we can create like a better standard of living. We can create a society like us. And the thing is that technology is not really empowering that modality of human existence right now. In fact, it's kind of doing the opposite. So there is a big opportunity for a lot of reinvention inside of computer technology, which is not being explored right now. There's a lot of really interesting techniques as well, like for example, anything to do with ring signatures, where you can have a ring of public keys, and out of those public keys, you can make a signature, and you can make a proof that proof that one of those keys in the ring signed, but you don't know which of those keys is responsible for signing, and you can use that to create systems for people to be able to make decisions on a large scale. For projects to be able to manage their documentation collaboratively. A lot of common tasks that we do where we write a document, and we want to collaborate with other people on writing a document is quite cumbersome. So the technology, the software products are very inefficient. They're not properly designed. And ring signatures itself is like a very simple technique, which now, because of of cryptocurrency and cryptography has made its way into the hands of programmers, but there's a lot of new technologies coming about. So one of the inefficiencies of ring signatures is that it has like a linear speed, so it means the number of rings that you add into that. So for example, if you had like a municipality and it issued bonds for a society, and if you had like 1 million people in there, then the speed to generate that signature would be linear. So as you increase that by 10 times, the speed would increase by 10 times. But there's new techniques, like for example, 1 out of n commitment to 0, or Lelantus, where they do some cryptographic techniques, and you're able basically to, in what's called a logarithmic speed, compute the proof. So as opposed to, for example, ring signatures, which for 100,000 keys, let's say you make an anonymous wallet, would take, like I got down to around 6.5 seconds. In this case would be literally milliseconds. So, it could be 0.5 milliseconds. So incredibly fast, incredibly efficient, that enable us to create anonymous, decentralized cryptographic systems between massive groups of people, huge groups of people, like hundreds of thousands of people, to be able to create all different subsystems. And in particular, was also interesting is also there is the concept of accumulators, which right now the biggest problem in blockchain is that you have these blockchains which over time are adding more and more data and increasing linearly. So you have this massive blockchain that's gigabytes of data and can't be stored. But there's a lot of new research around something called accumulators, which is, instead of having like a blockchain where if you make a transaction, I need to look in my blockchain and I need to say, okay, where is this transaction spending? Is that valid? Okay, it's valid. I accept the transaction. Accumulator is like a box, and in the box you can put things and you can take things out of it. And so that means that you can make a transaction, and the transaction is taking something out of the box, and you don't need an entire blockchain. You just need like a small number like this and a proof that you generate. And so what that means is you can make blockchains which are extremely small, which is, you can make a constant sized blockchain. So as opposed to needing all those gigabytes of data, you can have a blockchain which is constant sized. So that means that the blockchain can run, for example, on a mobile phone. A lot of this is all new research that is coming out, but something like Bitcoin, where Bitcoin, it's slow, it's inefficient, you've got a massive blockchain, it's not anonymous. There is new research coming out, and there will be anonymous, fast, scalable cryptocurrencies that can run on the mobile phone. That's pretty much I believe, an inevitability at this point. Projects. So, for example, Monero is not anonymous. Mimblewimble is not anonymous. Zcash, they've burnt through all the money. The zero knowledge proofs that they use, ZK snarks, is tremendously complicated. There was like a bug in the Zcash code that existed for 2 years. If anybody found that bug, they'd be able to print an infinite amount of money and nobody would know about it. There's a lot of problems with the anonymous cryptocurrencies, but there is also a lot of very interesting research which exists and has not yet been applied. And in fact, the scheme that I mentioned earlier, the 1 out of n scheme, has been improved, and it's got another name called Lelantus, which is actually developed by the cryptocurrency Zcoin, and they are implementing that scheme. And what's interesting about that scheme is it have very strong anonymity, the same as Zcash, but the mathematics is a lot simpler. It's a lot simpler to understand and to implement. And so what that means is it reduced the risk, the same risk that Zcash have. So So a lot of these techniques now, they're coming into the fore, and you know, I think like anonymous cryptocurrencies, you know, they kind of, you know, I don't know when it could be. It could be 2 years from now. It could be longer. It could be faster. Really, it's like a kind of social question. It's not like a limitation on the technology. It's like a question of like how fast people can mobilize to implement these things. And there's also a lot of other interesting things. For example, Coconut is anonymous blinded credential system, which enable people to make a blinded credential, which you can use to authenticate yourself in an anonymous network with some kind of service to be able to access or to use that service. And so you can, so Coconut credential system. What's interesting about that is also how we can use that to create new systems to allow people to organize on a scale. And you've also got another type of zero knowledge proof, which is called Sigma, or Sigma protocols, which is comparatively very simple and enable us to build zero knowledge systems. So the real question is not that there's like a lack of techniques or mechanisms. It's like, how do we combine these, like to build products? You know, like what are the products that we need to build? And that's the issue, is that the engineers are building this stuff, or the academics are coming up with this stuff. And the academics are over here, and then inventing all these cool ideas. And then the developers are over here, and they're working on this thing. And the designers are over here working on a wallet. And the business people are over here hoarding money. And none of these people are working together. They're all in separate silos. And the reason is there's like nothing that binds these people together. You know, there's no clear objective or like mission plan, you know. So yeah, that's basically my main research has been about anonymity recently. And you know, like what we're doing is to create an organization that's able to kind of combine all these arms. And you know, like the way that we want to structure it is between 4 sections, where you have like a research section that take all these ideas and develop prototypes, and then you have like a think tank which is responsible for doing this analysis of the market and the research and helping define the vision. And you have like a media arm which is responsible for like helping to spread the ideas and the philosophy and do marketing. And you have like a business arm which is able to take the prototypes and field them in the market to be able to get income to fund the other parts of the operation, you know. And also how the things are structured, with each section having one representative from each arm, which have equal power in decision making, and then below them having subcommittees, and at the base of it having cells of people. And the root of this system is system of self-study, also with a system of academies, where right now, inside of blockchain, I see a massive human resource is underutilized, which is there is a lot of young people who they see a big opportunity because they know that blockchain is going to be big in the future. And these young people, they're looking to enter the space. You know, they don't have any responsibility, they don't have any family. They're very ambitious, they're very creative, they're very dedicated. But unfortunately, a lot of their time now is spent just trying with their basic survival or meeting their basic needs. So if you can give them the space to be able to develop themselves, and also to give them orientation, because young people need orientation, that is a very powerful creative force you can concentrate in one place, have vitalizing energy. The problem is now that what crypto space look like is a bunch of micro-feudal kingdoms which are all kind of competing to one-up each other. And there's no really like bigger sense of like, you know, like what we can achieve in the long term, you know, and what, like, really we have this capability amongst ourselves to be able to, you know, really be able to, you know, take down national economies or to reshape global geopolitics, but it will require a large amount of systematic organization and a philosophy behind how we mobilize to be able to affect that change. And you know, we have to develop the software, and we have to think not in terms of technology just for individuals or for users, but like infrastructure. We need to think about like how do we deploy technology on a wider scale in a society, and that means as well we need to develop the products. But through developing the products, we can abstract away the technology to be able to build a platform. And that platform is what will enable us to quickly innovate, to be able to quickly enter new markets when the opportunity arises, and develop, really push forwards the concept of dark financial products, you know, dark economy. Because right now, I see when I speak with people who are actually involved in the trade and the money, it's very different from when I talk with developers and the focus of the developers, the type of financial instruments or products that need to be developed, you know, and the technology that's available to develop these products. Right now, the actual products that are being used in the financial market, where all of this big money is flowing through, is actually kind of primitive. It's all very centralized. It's not anonymous. You know, a lot of legal agreements are used to fill the place where cryptography would actually be useful. Really, I think the most important thing in cryptocurrency community right now is the intellectual level is quite low, and that's really what the root of all this problem is. And we kind of need to nurture that kind of talent, and so that's kind of why one of the focuses that we're doing now is to set up academies, a system of academies which will kind of be centers of learning and study, you know, and also kind of like a way of life, you know, like people who really want to do something with their life, or they have a sense of ambition, you know, where they can go, they can do sports, and they can learn philosophy, and they can work on world-changing technology. And those are the kind of raw material that actually make up the core of what serves as like a driving force of social change throughout history. You know, like our goal really is to make a platform for the dark economy, and you know, like to create like a new society where there is no state, or where the state have much less power, and instead what is actually the real power is the social relations between people, or the philosophy that we have, you know. And that's really, it doesn't matter what system you create. In the end of the day, the system will always be corrupted if you know if there isn't the right kind of vision or belief system behind that, you know, that people aren't able to think further ahead about what's possible. You know, if right now that's kind of like the decline of the West, is the West has become purely opportunistic, even on a macro level in terms of geopolitics. There's no clear objectives. You know, America's lurching from one chaos to another chaos, getting stuck in all these local conflicts where they have a very simplistic, black and white, moralistic worldview between good and bad, not understanding the complexities of the situation they're getting involved in. And the West is kind of like in a similar state in general inside of the society, you know, where, you know, you've got the most amount of division that we've had for ages between the left and the right, and the right is really kind of becoming ascendant. So the academies are centers of activity where we work on things, you know, where people learn through working on practical projects, but people also study theory. You know, they do study, and also where we disseminate our ideas, you know, where we not just, here's the technical skills that you learn them, but the why behind that. Like, why are we doing this thing? You know, the give people the motivation behind it. And I'm going to end also with about ancient Greece. Ancient Greece had what were called academies or gymnasiums, and these were places that young people in the society went to do sports, and they would also learn about mathematics and philosophy. And it was in these places where they would have debates, where they would learn. And it was also where Socrates recruited his early followers, including Aristotle and Plato. And when Christianity came to Greece and shut down these academies, all the teachers went east to Baghdad, and they founded the House of Baghdad, which is what initiated the Islamic Golden Age. The modern university system that we have today is a degenerate version of the ancient Greek Aristotelian academies, and yet states have realized that for the general wealth of society, we have to support research. Yet cryptocurrency community, there doesn't really seem to be that kind of space opened up for experimentation or to like support like large like big vision in the clouds thinking, and so that's kind of what my analysis of like why Ethereum kind of happened, and yet Ethereum has failed to deliver and will fail to deliver. And also this problem of power as well, where you have new elites emerging and new cliques emerging that are becoming increasingly shut off, and it's very difficult for other people to come into that, enter into that. These structures are becoming solidified. So we have to create another structure for people to be able to have a path into that centers of power. So yeah, that's basically, I had to write it on the way here, but yeah, thanks for listening.